Well, tonight we're diving into the Gospel of Mark, and we are doing Mark just this evening. So the whole Gospel of Mark tonight, and Mark is the shortest gospel, as you saw in your reading. And it's thought that Mark is the earliest gospel that's been written, and Matthew and Luke pull content from Mark as well. And so you have these gospels and that seem to be pulling from Mark, because a lot of Mark's content is also contained within those other two gospels. John, as we talked about before, that gospel is a little different, and each one has a different emphasis to it. The Gospel of Mark, tradition says that it was John Mark who wrote the Gospel of Mark in Rome, and that's like modern scholars are more, we don't know who wrote the Gospel of Mark. That's the tradition that John Mark wrote it, but they're not really sure. There doesn't seem to be a lot of like first century evidence to support that claim within the Gospel of Mark, but it does seem to be that it is the earliest gospel of the others that is being written. And in part because of how it talks about the Jewish revolt in 66, that it kind of alludes to it, but doesn't talk about it more, whereas Matthew and Luke seem to have more knowledge about that in the way that they're writing. And so that's why, in part, they think Mark is the earlier gospel. But to get us started, I've got two videos tonight, one on Mark and one on the Gospels, like with an overview of the Gospels. So I wanted to watch, let's start with the overview of the Gospels first, and then we'll dive into Mark, and then take a look at that summary video of the Gospel of Mark. Let me share my screen here. Make sure I get sound shared. All right.
There are 4 books in the Bible that are ancient biographies of Jesus: the Gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
And while individual stories about Jesus and his teachings are familiar to many people, these books have way more to offer if we read them from beginning to end and see how they connect Jesus' story into the overall biblical storyline.
So let's talk about how to read the Gospel. First of all, this word gospel, what does it mean?
Well, it means good news.
Which raises the question, good news about what?
Well, in Mark's gospel, Jesus enters the story announcing that the time is fulfilled. God's kingdom has come near, so turn around and trust this good news.
So the good news is about God's kingdom arriving, but what does that mean?
Well, it's Jesus' way of summarizing the whole biblical story that leads up to himself.
The whole story. Okay, give me the short version.
Well, the story begins with God creating a good world and then appointing humanity as his representatives to rule it. But then the humans rebel over and over, leading to a world of violence and death.
That's a problem.
But God's committed to making it work. So he chooses Abraham and his family to restart the project. Then through Moses, God brings the family into a garden land of abundance so that he can restore all of the nations through them.
Right, Israel becomes a kingdom with amazing kings like David, but eventually Israel rebels too, and it leads them into destruction.
But Israel's prophets said that God wasn't giving up. He was going to personally come and restore Israel so that his justice and peace could spread to all nations and to all creation. This hope was called the kingdom of God.
And that's what Jesus said he was bringing to Israel.
Yes, Jesus' good news is about God's kingdom, the new creation that was arriving to restore humanity to their role as God's partners in ruling the world. This is why the gospel has so many stories about Jesus liberating people from death and disease, along with all of his teachings about generosity to the poor or forgiveness and loving your enemies.
He was inviting people to live in God's new world.
Exactly. And so this is one of the main goals of the gospel, to show how Jesus is bringing the whole biblical story to its fulfillment.
So that's why the gospel authors are constantly appealing to the Hebrew scriptures while telling the story of Jesus.
Yeah, like when Jesus is born in Bethlehem, Matthew reminds us that this was anticipated by the prophet Micah.
And he directly quotes from Micah.
Yeah, these direct quotes are really common. But more often, the gospel authors weave biblical phrases into the story without telling you, so you can discover it for yourself. Like when Jesus is baptized and God announces from the skies,
"You are my son, my beloved. With you I am well pleased."
Now, if you do some digging, you'll find that God's statement blends together phrases from 3 biblical texts to identify Jesus as the royal son of David, the seed of Abraham, and the servant who's going to suffer for the sins of his people.
Whoa, that is subtle.
Yes, and the gospel accounts do this on every page. Every book is constantly showing how all of the biblical stories about Abraham or Moses and David and all the prophets, all of it points forward to Jesus.
Now, why are there 4 different accounts? Wouldn't one be enough?
Well, the diversity is on purpose. Each of the 4 gospel authors has shaped and arranged their stories about Jesus differently, so they can emphasize different things about him. Matthew presents Jesus as a greater Moses, and so he's grouped Jesus' teachings into 5 large blocks, just like the 5 books of the Torah. Luke highlights how Jesus is God's royal servant from the book of Isaiah, who brings God's light to the nations. Mark presents Jesus as a new start for humanity, bringing the mystery of God's new creation crashing into the present. And John focuses on Jesus' claim to be Yahweh, the God of Israel, become human, to do for us what we could never do for ourselves.
Those are really different from each other, but they all tell the same basic story. A man from the region of Galilee teaching this good news, but who's ultimately crucified as a criminal.
Yes, all 4 books of the gospel are showing how the arrival of God's kingdom through Jesus led him up to the cross, where he was enthroned as the king of God's new world.
He's given a robe, a crown, and a scepter.
Right. And as Jesus suffers the consequences of humanity's rebellion, he's showing that the power of God's kingdom comes through his love and self-sacrifice. And when he's raised from the dead, we're watching the dawn of the new creation.
So, the gospel authors don't just want their readers to know about the good news of God's kingdom. They want them to become a part of it.
Yes, the gospel is designed to persuade us to trust and follow Jesus so that we can participate in the new creation that he began.
Initial thoughts on that, on the Gospel of Mark and the video from Bible Project.
I thought that was very interesting that Mark's gospel definitely does not begin with going through the angel addressing Mary and the birth and all of that good stuff. It starts right off at the beginning with just a tiny bit about John, and then we are in Jesus' ministry. And I really appreciated what they said about Mark brings that position right smack dab in the middle of current life at that time. Really drives home what the good news was and how it evolved. He doesn't spend a tremendous amount of time on the birth. There are tons of parables and teaching moments, and just a little bit about the crucifixion, resurrection at the end. Very, very tiny little bit, I thought, which kind of surprised me a little bit, because as I was rereading it, I couldn't help but think how many times we have been told all of these different stories, but in bits and pieces here and there. and to have them all together and to read it as one book, it was really very interesting. It really, really piqued my imagination through it.
Yeah, you definitely get something different when you read them all together versus when we just read sections. Because otherwise we think about it, I mean, even the story that we tell at Christmas time, it's actually a compilation of the Gospels. It's not just one of the Gospels. The Magi don't show up in both. The shepherds aren't in both. Jesus' birth story is not even in both. There are angels in all of them. And so we kind of pull out of those different pieces. And in the lectionary, so we follow the Revised Common Lectionary, which is on a 3-year cycle. And in that, we follow a different gospel in each of those years. But still, we're not always reading it in order. And there's also other pieces of other gospels mixed in with the readings too, sometimes as well. Because there's 4 gospels and it's a 3-year cycle. And so it's not always clear. But yeah, one of the main pieces, like open from the start, one of the first things that we notice is there is no birth story in the Gospel of Mark. We don't have that story that we're really well related. Like, no, there's also no genealogy that's being told. And in Matthew, that was important. It was important that there be a birth story in Matthew, because remembering Matthew's goal is showing how Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophecies. And so Matthew had even more pieces from the Old Testament that are direct quotations. Mark doesn't have as many direct quotations. There still are direct quotations from the Hebrew Bible, but there aren't as many as there were in Mark. But there's a lot of allusions to the Old Testament throughout the Gospel of Mark, and in all of the Gospels there are, but it's not as obvious to us. It would be language that people would be aware of and would know if they knew the stories well, but otherwise they might not catch it. The other thing about Mark is it's written in popular Greek, a style of popular Greek. And so we get this word immediately a lot in Mark. You probably noticed that, and some English translations tone it down because it's hard to read how often it says "and immediately," and immediately, and immediately, and immediately. So that that's a part of the Gospel of Mark, but part that's also a part of popular Greek style for that type of language at that time. And so some of that is pointing to maybe the time period that it's being written, just the style of writing matches that period of language as well. But that would be the word of Mark for sure. If we gave the Gospels one word, Matthew, maybe we'd give fulfilled or fulfillment. And Mark, we just give immediately. That's definitely Mark's word, is immediately in out here. The other thing that's interesting about Mark is there is no, as we talked about, no birth story, no genealogy. So there's no glorious beginning. There's no like, from the virgin, this child was born. None of that. And there's no happy ending either. It's a cliffhanger. When it ends. And that is important, that it has neither of these pieces in the Gospel of Mark. So Mark, when we get to the end, there's the shorter ending of Mark, and then there's a longer ending to Mark too. And in both, I don't know how it says in your Bible, but so we've got the earliest ending of Mark would be this. he has, let's see. So the women are out at the tomb, and then they entered the tomb. They saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
Mhm.
That's like the original ending of Mark.
Oh, really?
So
Oh,
it's there, right there. That's,
okay.
So there's, obviously this didn't sit well with people as they kept passing the story on with Mark. So there's two alternative endings that were added later that are in a little different style. And those are the ones, we've got the shorter ending of Mark and the longer ending of Mark that were added on.
Mhm.
Because you have this Mark ending. I mean, you can see why maybe it wouldn't sit well. They don't even see Jesus at the end of the oldest ending of Mark. They see somebody in a white robe that says, "He's not here. Go, you'll see him on the road to Galilee." So they go and they like run away and tell no one. The end. End
Mhm.
of story. So then they added this. And all that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterwards, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. So it was so uncomfortable for people that we added another ending, and we said, briefly, they went and told people. So really quickly, they did a little side mention. They made sure they let Peter know, and then they still don't say that Jesus himself showed up. What they say was Jesus went out through them, that like through the work that they did, this was continued. But still, that obviously did really well. So then we've got the longer ending as well. Jesus appears.
Right. So do the Scott, oh, go ahead, Louise. I'll hold my thought.
What?
Well,
What were you saying, Louise?
I'm very dense tonight. From the beginning, everything he did, he says, I'll heal you, but don't tell somebody I did this. I'll do this, but don't tell somebody. How come? What?
Yes. So, Mary, do you have a question before we, because that takes us into another place.
I was just wondering if are there scholars who have a reason why the original ending would be the way it is? Because I certainly can't think of any that would further I can't think of any reason that this does something that a gospel writer would want to happen.
Sure. So it'll tie into with Louise's question too. But so there's different records of the Gospel of Mark, and some ancient authorities only end at verse 8, which was they told no one. And some of them end with the shorter ending, and some end with the longer ending. And so we have different authorities with that. But part of it is in Mark, it's a very interesting, it's different understanding of Messiah that's happening in Mark. And so we're going to start there and see if we can unpack from there. So we've got the understanding of the Messiah, and who this in Mark, they say a lot. Jesus says, don't tell anyone. Don't go tell anyone. Don't say these things. Don't tell anybody. And so what is a Messiah? The understanding of a Messiah in some Jewish texts, they don't even expect there to be a Messiah. That the text that we say as Christians go forward to have proclamations of Jesus coming. just as when we read them, when we were reading through the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, we saw that they had other parallels too, about returning from exile, or King Cyrus, or different things that they were maybe proclaiming towards, and not necessarily proclaiming towards a Messiah like Jesus. And so not everyone was expecting a Messiah to even show up. And there were also other leaders at the time, as we talked about last week, that proclaimed that they were the Messiah. And this was something people would say. They would say, you know, I'm the Messiah, or I'm the child of God. That was a proclamation people would make. Normally when people made that, they died because they were killed. Because when you claim that you're the Messiah, usually they would be killed. And for those who did think there was a Messiah coming, what they would have been expecting was freedom from oppression. They would have been expecting driving out Israel's enemies, a delivery of the people, because that would be the role of the Messiah. And on all accounts of that, of what they were expecting, Jesus did not do those things. Jesus did not get rid of Rome. Jesus did not, it wasn't a sudden change that the Rome was overthrown. They didn't get independence after this. And so the things that they expected a Messiah to do didn't actually happen. Another understanding of Messiah would be that it would bring prosperity and maybe peace, was another hope from the Messiah. But there is no text that says at the time of their expectations would be that the Messiah would suffer. And so that was not something. And so Jesus as the Messiah, he did not fit people's expectations of a Messiah. And Messiah was also a political term that people were using too. So you'd Caesar was the son of God. Religion and politics weren't separated. These were claims that people would make to claim that I have political authority and religious authority, and these two things are blended with one another. And so that's a little background on the word Messiah, which means it's a very loaded term. So that would be part of the reason Jesus might have said, don't tell people I'm the Messiah. There is a lot going on here. And if you put this word Messiah on me, that, he's not even meeting the expectations of what people thought a Messiah would be. And there's all these political implications attached to it as Jesus as the Messiah. So there's this, don't tell people. Other views, different scholars think maybe Jesus or Mark presented Jesus this way, that Jesus said, no, don't tell anybody that I'm the Messiah, because some scholars think maybe Jesus didn't think he was the Messiah, and he only later claimed that as people started to call him the Messiah. So that's what some scholars think too. And so Mark tells this story from the beginning to the end as if, as the story goes through, only certain people know that Jesus is the Messiah, and that it was kind of a bit of a cover up, I guess, that this Jesus was doing these things and people didn't really understand why in the moment. They didn't fully understand, which we hear that in the Gospels, the people didn't understand. And so this gospel would be the earliest written one, and people are still trying to figure out, why did these things happen the way that they happened? And that maybe they're still exploring that even in the writing of the Gospel of Mark too. And trying to cover up a little bit the amount of confusion that people had at encountering Jesus, and trying to figure out, is this the Messiah? Because yes, we can connect these prophecies, we can connect these writings from the Old Testament, but we're also having to stretch some of them too. And this is not exactly what we expected a Messiah to be. And this isn't even how we use the term Messiah so far in our history, because Jesus didn't overthrow Rome. Jesus didn't bring a complete political and religious change to the whole area. And so then they're kind of, the term Messiah would have been very voted at that time.
Mhm.
So part of Mark also saying, Jesus saying, don't tell anybody, is Mark is trying to pull the rug out of the old expectations of who a Messiah is too, for the people. Because as this earlier gospel, people still would have been carrying some of those expectations of a Messiah that were from that period. So it's trying potentially in using this literary style to try to pull that out and to get people to think about a Messiah differently than the way that they had been. So then we come to this ending with why would anyone ever want to end the Gospel of Mark in this way? Why would anybody end any story with, and they told no one? Well, I always think it's interesting. First of all, if they told no one, none of us would know of this story.
Yes.
So obviously that's not the end. I think that's one of the powers in us reading it just to that and not reading the shorter and longer ending is, yeah, for terror and amazement had seized them. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that's where the story ends. But it's after that is also our role, because part of the gospel's point is to try to draw us in. And obviously they told someone, and it's on the reader to be a part of the story now too, and to go and tell the story as well. And that it's ending it with, they told no one for they were afraid. It's like you're being invited into something that is very special and sacred, and might feel like a secret, but obviously also we're invited to share that too, because they were invited to share it as well. And
I've got a footnote from 69 through 20. Important early church fathers endorse this passage, and it does not seem likely that Mark would end his story on a note of fear. And yeah, if they saw this guy in white and they took off, turned away in fear, that's what you would have been left with. It just seems like that would have been extremely incomplete and contrary to what Mark was trying to share all through the gospel to that point. So I don't think that that early ending was correct. He's got all of this hope and this joy and this the good stuff coming, the good news being spread, and to leave it there. Okay, he died and the women went to the tomb and they were scared, and that's it. Ooh, I wouldn't have liked to see it ended there. So,
but he doesn't leave it there. He leaves it there in the writing. Well, he leaves it there in the writing, but it's up to the listener to carry it farther then, if that's where it's being ended. The other thing about that ending is that Mark is being written in a very difficult political time. It's hard for us to imagine that because we don't live in a time that is at that level of political instability. We have our own political instability, but we're still not at that level of where they were at that time period. And so this would have been a very dangerous time also for the writer of Mark to proclaim that Jesus was the Messiah and to proclaim that he was risen from the like that and appeared to. Like it that could have been dangerous. So that might have been another reason to write it the way that it was written, that it made it a text that could be shared with a little more safety than if they would have written it in a different way.
With whom would
So-
they have shared it?
Well,
This was written
So
about 30 years after the crucifixion.
well, they were at that time they were trying to expand the church, get people to
Mhm.
join, and so you would be
Mhm.
sharing the gospels with people who were
Mhm.
trying to get people to join Christianity.
Mhm.
So they would have been sharing it with other people in the world, other people who were Romans, people who were part of the cultures. A lot of early people probably were. I mean, we hear in the letters that it's families and young children and women who are joining. So maybe people on outskirts of Rome, especially, were hearing this. But Christians were not beloved in the Roman Empire as the early church, and there were so the issue with Christians was not that Christians worshipped God or that they believed the story about Jesus. The issue with Christians was that Christians were seen as atheists because Christians were not following the gods of Rome. And that's what was wrong with Christians. Not that they worshiped God, like that was fine. You can worship God, you can worship other gods, because in ancient Rome, the religion was that you'd have multiple levels of gods. You'd have a house god, you'd have a job god, you'd have a family god, you'd have a city god. You had all different gods. And there was no reason to argue about religion because the gods weren't in competition with one another. You were just expected to give devotion to them. That's it. And the religions weren't in competition with each other. You were just expected to be a part of it. Religion wasn't necessarily that which determined morality. There was morality, but it wasn't tied closely with religion in ancient Roman times. But if you did not observe the gods, you weren't a good citizen. That is what could cause a social collapse, and you were acting in socially counter ways. And so Christians were seen as antisocial people and people who were like really against the culture. And we're actively working against that by only believing in one God was the actual issue. And so, yeah, so so then they would be telling people, because most religious movements grow just through human relationships. So passing that story on there. The other thing about the Gospels, just texts in general, is generally they weren't read quietly to yourself. Like when we read a book, we just read silently. So that's not how people would have been reading. Being able to read wasn't something that everyone could do. Writing was extremely expensive and time consuming. Punctuation was different as well, especially in Hebrew. You don't have punctuation, you don't have vowels. Vowels, it's like doing, have any of you ever played Mad Gab? The game Mad Gab, or it's a bunch of letters put together, and the only way that you can tell what it says is by saying it out loud. And you say it out loud to try to figure out what it says. That's how people were reading scripture. You never read silently to yourself. If you were reading, you read out loud. And even if it was just you alone, you would be reading out loud. And so if you were reading these, people might overhear you reading unless you had a really quiet place. But population density was quite high at this time too. We mostly know pop culture about Rome, and we think about the elites, which is a small percentage of people. everybody else is a dense population area and all the problems that that brings as well.
So what I'm getting from this then is that you have this written gospel, but that wouldn't be the only way that you would, there'd be like a human component to add on to it or tell more of the story or somehow add to it. I mean, I've never thought about this at all, ever. So that's why I'm just trying this idea on for size, that it would depend also on people, as you were saying, Gretchen, a little bit ago, that it would just this book, even this book of Mark is not by itself, it's being read by somebody and maybe in a group of people. And there's the group of people too that makes it effective in getting new followers.
Right. And it's
Oh,
in ancient, I mean, Judaism has a rich tradition around that you would read scripture, you'd meditate upon scripture, and you discuss scripture. And you look at it with your rational mind as well. You don't just receive, you are a part. And so that you would be a part of that too. And so community discussions around the scriptures probably were a part of it. We hear that too when we will read through the letters as well. There's people are teaching and preaching, and everybody has different gifts that are being shared, and the letters are being written. Whenever they say don't do something, it means somebody's doing it. Otherwise, why would you say don't do it? So they're having discussions and they're having disagreements about these things.
oh, interesting.
Now, and we can't say exactly, none of us know exactly where the different endings started, or if there were certain traditions that had a certain ending and then other ones had a different ending, or if they were being told orally and then there was a storyteller who's like, I really don't like that ending, so I'm changing it, or what it might be. But Mark is a really good, there's so much literary richness in Mark too. And we, I think, miss that sometimes, just as we talked about in the Hebrew Bible, that there's just how things are said and the way that things are put together has a lot of literary genius within it. And whenever you look at a work of art, sometimes the parts of the art that are disturbing to us are the most important parts of the art, and they're meant to be disturbing to us, or they're meant to pull out emotions. And so if the shorter ending where it ends with them afraid is like it is one of the original endings in some authorities. Part of that may have been part of Mark's literary style too, to say, look, we're ending here. And now, like, how whenever you watch a movie and you leave the movie and you're like, man, I wish I had a different ending. Like, you talk a lot more about a movie when it has a bad ending than you do when it's all satisfied, wrapped up, and then on the top of it. And maybe that's what Mark was trying to do. He's like, here's the story. Here's a cliffhanger for you. Now go talk about that. And even better, live your life with it. So there's reasons either way. I think there's a lot of reasons why maybe scholars, or why some writers have the longer ending with it. It is more comfortable, it wraps it up nicer, it matches the other gospels. But I think there are some strong arguments for why it might be the shorter ending. Because Mark throughout, there's some big things. Mark is definitely, he loves the conflict, he loves the action, he loves the drama. And it's his style is short and he moves and it keeps it moving. And throughout the whole thing, it's immediately this happened and immediately this happened.
Mhm.
There's not a lot of just, let's just meditate on what this means right now. It's immediately they jumped in a boat. Immediately now they fed a whole bunch of people. Then immediately they ran out of bread when they're on the boat again, which is kind of ironic. And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
moving through that. Another thing about Mark that's different than the other gospels is that Jesus kind of agonizes more within Mark than he does in Luke or John. And so we see a struggle in Jesus in the Gospel of Mark that we're not seeing in some of the other gospels. And so that can be read in different ways, but just something to point out for you.
Are you talking about Gethsemane?
Yes, and there's some other places too with Jesus saying like don't tell people, and there seems to be just the way it's written, kind of some like anxiety in that, or some like let's not do it this way, let's not do it this way. And that's not present in the others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mark, another thing that's interesting in contrast to Matthew, because Matthew is quoting a lot from the Old Testament. Mark does not, but he makes allusions very often. So just to show you some, so if we go to Mark chapter 4, verse 35, 35. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, let's go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was asleep in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? This has echoes, this storm story has echoes to this back to the Psalms within it. So Psalm 107, it echoes back to that one. Some sat in darkness, sin and gloom, prisoners in misery and in irons, for they had rebelled against the words of the God and spurned the counsel of the Most High. Their hearts were bowed down with hard labor. They fell down with no one to help. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and God saved them from their distress. God brought them out of darkness and gloom and broke their bonds asunder. So there's these kind of this call out that happens within there. And also just the element of the storm later on in 107 towards 25. This is Psalm. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their calamity. And so we hear these echoes from the Psalms. It's not word for word. It's not quoting the Bible, but it is pulling to mind parts from the Hebrew Bible just woven within this. So whoever wrote Mark would have been well versed in the Hebrew scriptures. So much so that he didn't have to cite his sources, he just wove it in, just very part of just his very blood.
Oh, yeah. Verse 29 is almost exactly the same. He hushed the storm to a gentle whisper so that the waves of the sea were still.
Yep.
Yeah.
And we see it again, another place with a well-known one is chapter 6, verse 30. We see echoes in this section back to Psalm 23. We hear in Mark, it talks about this green grass, there's green pastures in 23. Then we hear echoes to this sheep without a shepherd, and it goes back to this good shepherd. And so it's using some of those same pieces.
You said chapter 6, verse 23.
Starting in 30, chapter 6,
Oh.
the whole story, starting in 30.
Oh, starting in 30. Okay.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yep.
Why is that? Oh, double, almost identically. It's the way I read it.
What's that?
Huh?
You're saying
Like,
something?
I thought I saw it again. Yeah, okay. Chapter. In chapter, chapter 8. Must be chapter 6. Starting with 30, my headline says, Jesus feeds more than 5,000 people. Well, then over in the next, in chapter 8, it starts out, Jesus feeds more than 4,000 people.
Yeah, so something,
Same story.
two different feedings.
Okay. Because it's so similar.
Right.
We have 7 loaves of bread. Same thing they said before. I was just asking.
Yeah. That it, the way Mark is telling it is that this was maybe a common occurrence. That was happening.
Okay.
When you come before Jesus, you will be fed. And
Mhm.
that's just how it is. And it will be in ways you didn't expect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we went kind of lost track of time talking about Mark. Would you like to watch the Bible Project summary of the Gospel of Mark?
Mhm.
So this video, it's 9 minutes and 31 seconds. So
Okay.
I will start that.
Collected all of the eyewitness.
Let's start it at the beginning though. There we go.
The Gospel according to Mark. It's one of the first accounts of the life of Jesus, and our earliest historical traditions link this book to a Christian scribe named Mark, or John Mark. He was a co-worker with Paul and a close partner with Peter. And in fact, an ancient church historian named Papias, he recalls that Mark had collected all of the eyewitness accounts and memories of Peter and then shaped them into this account. But Mark didn't just randomly throw the pieces together. He's carefully designed this story of Jesus. In the first line of the book, Mark makes this claim about Jesus. It's the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, what's interesting is that this is the only time Mark is going to tell you what he thinks. For the rest of the book, he's going to influence you by simply putting Jesus's actions and words in front of you and showing you how other people react to him. Now, Mark's designed the story of Jesus as a drama with 3 acts. The first one set in Galilee, the third one is set in Jerusalem, and the second act shows Jesus on the way from one place to the other. And each of the acts focuses on a repeated theme. So in Act 1, everybody's blown away by Jesus, and they're wondering, who is this Jesus? In Act 2, it's the disciples who are struggling to understand what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. And then in Act 3, we watch the surprising paradox of how Jesus becomes the Messianic King. Let's just dive in and you'll see how it unfolds. After the opening line, Mark begins with a quotation from the ancient prophets Isaiah and Malachi, who said that God would send a messenger to Israel to prepare them for when God would show up himself to rescue his people and become their king. And Mark introduces John the Baptist as that messenger, and then right when you expect God to show up personally, Mark introduces Jesus. And as he comes onto the scene, the heavens open, God's Spirit descends on Jesus, and God says, "You are my beloved Son." After this, Mark places in front of us a summary of Jesus' core message. He went about Galilee announcing the good news that God's kingdom has come near. Jesus is carrying forward the story from the Old Testament scriptures about God's rescue operation for his world. Through Jesus, God is restoring his reign over the world by confronting and defeating evil and its hold on people's lives, and then by inviting them to live under his reign by following Jesus. From here, Mark's given us a big block of stories showing us Jesus' power as he brings God's kingdom. He goes about healing people whose bodies are sick or broken or under the oppression of dark spiritual powers. And Jesus even does something that for Jewish people only God has the right to do. He forgives people's sins. And Jesus' actions here produce lots of different responses. So some people follow him and become his disciples. Other people don't know what to think, and still others reject him completely, especially Israel's leaders who accuse him of blaspheming God and being empowered by evil. But Jesus isn't surprised by these responses. In fact, he draws attention to it. In chapter 4, Mark has collected many of Jesus' parables about the hidden, mysterious nature of God's kingdom. And Jesus says that his message is like seed falling on different types of soil. Some are receptive, some are not. Or it's like a mustard seed that's very tiny. It seems insignificant, but then it grows huge and surprises everyone. Jesus' point is that he really is the Messiah, bringing God's kingdom, but it doesn't look like what anybody expected. And this growing confusion about Jesus among the crowds is connected to a key idea Mark emphasizes at the end of Act 1, that even among Jesus' disciples there's confusion. Even they are struggling to grasp who Jesus really is, and that brings us to Act 2. It begins with a crucial conversation. Jesus takes the disciples aside and he asks, "Who do you all say that I am?" And Peter speaks up saying, "You're the Messiah." But it becomes clear that for Peter, this means that Jesus is a victorious military king from the line of David who will rescue Israel from the Romans. But for Jesus to be the Messiah means that he's the suffering servant king of Isaiah 53, who will bring God's rule by giving up his life in Jerusalem. And the disciples, they don't get it. They think following King Jesus is going to mean fame and status and importance, and Jesus makes it clear that following him is actually like dying, like carrying your own cross. It means rejecting violence and pride and selfishness and giving one's life out for others in acts of service and love. He has the same conversation with them 2 more times, and it all culminates in Jesus' important statement that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to become a servant and give his life as a ransom for many. The disciples still don't get it. They respond in confusion and fear. And so here in Act 2, Mark has placed another key story that echoes the book's introduction. Jesus takes 3 of his disciples up to a mountain, and he's suddenly transformed. He's radiating with light and glory, and a cloud envelops them. Now, this is just like the glory of the God of Israel that showed up long ago on Mount Sinai. And then the 2 prophets who stood in God's presence on Mount Sinai, Moses and Elijah, they appear next to Jesus as God announces again, "This is my beloved Son." Now, by placing this story in the middle of all these conversations in Act 2, Mark is making an astounding claim that Jesus, God's Son, is the physical embodiment of God's own glory. And in Jesus, the glorious God of Israel is going to become king by suffering and dying for the sins of his own people. It's a puzzling claim that confuses and scares the disciples as they leave the mountain. Which brings us to Act 3. Jesus makes a very public royal entry into Jerusalem for Passover. People are hailing him as the Messiah. Then he enters into the temple courtyard and he asserts his royal royal authority by running out the thieves and crooks and stopping the sacrificial system. Then this kicks off a whole week of Jesus debating and confronting the leaders of Israel, condemning their hypocrisy, and so they set in motion a plan to have him killed. And Jesus warns his disciples, predicting that Jerusalem and its temple will be destroyed within a generation, and his disciples will be persecuted just like him, until he returns one day to bring God's kingdom fully over the world. And it all leads up to the final night. Jesus has his last Passover meal with the disciples, a symbolic meal that told the story of Israel's liberation from slavery through the death of the Passover lamb. And Jesus takes these symbols and he gives them new meaning. They point to the liberation from sin and death that will happen through the death of the suffering servant Messiah. From here, the story rushes forward to Jesus' arrest, his trial before Israel's priests and the Roman governor Pilate, all resulting in Jesus' crucifixion. And it culminates in a key scene that matches the important scenes from Acts 1 and 2, except this time it's darkness that descends, not a cloud. And instead of the divine voice from heaven, it's Jesus' voice crying out before he dies. And then most surprising is that it's a Roman soldier who sees Jesus die, who grasps and then announces who Jesus is. This man was the Son of God. He's the first person in the story to recognize the story's shocking claim about Jesus' identity, that it's the crucified Son of God who's the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, who died for his friends and for his enemies. After this, Jesus' body is placed in a tomb, and on the first day of the new week, 2 women from his disciples come to the tomb, and they discover that the tomb is empty, the stones rolled away, and an angelic man informs them that Jesus isn't here, that he's risen from the dead. And so he orders them to go and tell this good news to the other disciples, that Jesus is alive, that he'll meet them back up in Galilee. And the women, they're freaked out. Mark says that they fled from the tomb in terror, telling no one, for they were afraid. And that's how the book ends, with Jesus' disciples showing the same kind of fear and confusion that concluded Acts 2 and 1. Now, if you look in your Bible, you'll see that the Gospel of Mark has more to its ending, where Jesus appears, he speaks to his disciples, but there's also a note there telling you that that ending is not part of the original book, that it's only found in later, less reliable manuscripts. Now, it's possible that the original ending got lost, or that Mark actually never finished writing his account, but it's more likely that this abrupt ending is intentional to make a point. The entire story has focused on the shocking claim that puzzled Jesus' disciples from beginning to end, that it's the suffering, crucified, and risen Jesus who's the Messiah, the Son of God. That God's love and upside-down kingdom were revealed as Jesus died for the sins of the world. And so this story ends without closure, and it forces you, the reader, to grapple with this very strange and scandalous claim about Jesus. And are you going to run away like the disciples? Or are you going to recognize Jesus as your king and go and tell the good news? And only you can answer that question. And that's what the Gospel of Mark is all about.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
I always like how they do go over the structure. It's easier to look at a book structure when you draw it out on a screen.
I know I'm being cynical, but back in chapter 11, verses 8 to 17, is a business about where he turned over the tables and the money changers in the temple. Temple's only for prayer. I've thought about this through the years, how our churches have used, sell so many things from the church. The Catholics are famous for their bingo and stuff, and we have our sales in all churches. You know, it's that's always gotten to me way back when. I don't disagree now, but I have that part just always strikes me about how this is a place for prayer, not for money changing.
However, well, maybe it is the same, but we always do our selling in the narthex, not the sanctuary.
They weren't doing it in the sanctuary proper either.
They weren't doing it in
Up
the
the front
sanctuary
steps.
either.
Yeah. I'm sure it was
Don't you
Caught my
dare
eye.
turn over any of my tables at rubber sale, please.
One difference with that would be that when they were doing the exchanges, there's also understanding that they were skimming off the top too. And so
Mhm.
there might have not been the most honest exchanges that were being done.
Uh,
And that, like, people have called out the church for that when you have institutions, sometimes institutions get a little too big for what's good for the faith. And so there have been times where we've called out. I mean, that's what prompted the Protestant Reformation, in part, was the indulgences and saying to the
Indulgence.
Catholic Church, this is not like,
Mhm.
we're just taking advantage of people's fear by saying you need to pay so that you can get out of purgatory.
right.
And
Mhm.
and then people did flip those tables, and they,
Mhm.
I mean, Martin Luther never meant to leave the Catholic Church, but that's what happened, because he couldn't find
Mhm.
a way to move away from that. And so I think still is warnings to churches too,
Mhm.
to watch, are we doing, whenever we do collect money, are we doing it
Mhm.
in a way that takes advantage of people? Are we doing it in a way that is not honest or is misleading to people? Or are we doing it is it an opportunity for people to give and to be a part of something greater? Because Jesus does also talk a lot about money and asks people to give money to the poor and give money,
Mhm.
to not hold so tightly to money, but that it can be a blessing in the communities too.
Mhm. Yeah.
I don't think there's nothing Jesus says that we can say we're exempt from.
Yeah, I'm going back to the same area in my Bible that talks about all the tables that belonged to people that were exchanging different kinds of money, and Jesus turned over the benches of those who were selling doves. Jesus refused to allow any person to carry things through the temple. It's what you said, Camille. We don't sell from the sanctuary.
Mhm.
And he done it through the temple. I think all the, at least things I've seen, the pictures we see, he seems to be in the front steps. He's knocking them all down the steps. But yeah,
Mhm.
just maybe just being different tonight. I'm in a mood. Mark was a lot easier to read than the Old Testament stuff that we had to read.
You're more familiar with it.
God is going to kill everybody all
Yeah.
the time.
Yeah.
What a
You've heard it
change.
before. It's like an old story that you've read many times
Mhm.
and enacted
That's
out
true.
various ways.
But I enjoyed reading it all together.
Yeah.
It,
I said
It,
every other line wasn't God was going to kill everybody,
yeah.
Which we had before.
It is different reading it all together.
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
changes it quite a bit.
Mhm.
Well, our next class will be on Luke. We'll jump into Luke. So that'll be next week, and we'll do the first half of Luke.
Good.
So Luke's it has Mark's content and more content, so it's longer. But listen, as you're reading through Luke, listen, maybe now that you've read Mark, you might hear parts of Mark again, and you hear some other parts. So we'll read the first half. So it'd be 1 through 12.
Mhm.
No rhyme or reason to why we're stopping there, just halfway.
Okay.
And we'll go into Luke then. And if other thoughts come up on Mark or Matthew or the Gospels in general, we can talk about that. So what we're going to do is we're going to do Luke this month, and then we won't have class on December 22nd, the week of Christmas. And we'll actually have a 3-week break. We won't have class in between Christmas and New Year's. and we won't have class on January 5th. So we'll have class on the 8th and the 15th of this month. And then we'll take a break and we'll pick up with John on January 12th. This is our schedule.
Okay.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Well,
Okay.
thank you for
Thanks very
coming.
much. Very
Yes, thank you.
interesting, very interesting. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thanks, everybody.